Hello, this is Professor Broker with your Chapter 11 Lecture 1 for Econ 231 titled Public Goods and Common Resources. Let's get started. So we've been looking at, in Chapter 10 and then also previously in Chapter 15, we looked at ways in which markets do not always efficiently allocate resources. Okay. Well, Chapter 11 is going to introduce another way that markets may not efficiently allocate resources. Okay. For example, we consume many goods without paying for them. Therefore, there's not an intuitive pricing mechanism to allocate to represent the costs and benefits of those resources, right? Parks, national defense, clean air and water, and so on. When goods have no prices, the market forces that normally allocate resources are really absent or just inadequate. Therefore, the private market may fail to allocate these resources efficiently or in a socially optimal way. Therefore, governments can sometimes improve market outcomes in these circumstances. And we're going to look at two specific circumstances where this may be true in society. Okay. The first thing we need to do, though, is to divide goods and services in our economy into four categories. Okay, we're going to divide them into four categories based on two different questions. One, is the good or service excludable, in consumption? So what that means is it's excludable if by me consuming it, it's excludable if someone can be prevented from consuming it if they don't pay for it. So things like food. Right, most food establishments can pretty easily prevent someone from consuming their food if they haven't paid for it. Same thing with like wireless internet access. It would be excludable, for example, if you had a password protected on your Wi-Fi at your apartment or home. Okay, if it's password protected, it would be excludable because if you don't have the password, you can't easily get on. However, it would not be excludable if it wasn't password protected. Okay, so excludable, non-excludable. Okay. Again, things like FM radio signals and tornado sirens. These are things that are not excludable. Okay, I mean, an FM radio signals are going out, and you can just tune in your radio to it. There's no excludability. Even if you don't contribute to say that radio station during their telephone or whatever. Same thing with the tornado siren. Okay, and then also the rival and consumption question. Is a good rival in consumption? What that means is does one person's use of a good diminish another person's use? Again, food is a good example here. If I eat a taco, I have diminished. In fact, I've eliminated anyone else's, potential consumption of that taco. Okay, and so that a food is rival in consumption. But some things are not rival in consumption. Think about a tornado siren. If you hear a tornado siren, that in no way prevents or diminishes your neighbor from hearing the same tornado siren. And so you can both get the benefit at the same time of that warning signal. And so, again, excludability and rival and consumption. Okay, so now let's take those two questions and the answers will be, yes or no to each question. And let's develop a grid here with four different categories. If goods or services are both rival in consumption and excludable, this is what we call private goods and services. This makes up the vast majority, something like 70 to 80% of the goods and services you consume in society. Okay, ice cream cones, clothing, so on. These are goods and services that, for the most part, are going to be pretty efficiently provided by the market outcome. The market outcome will provide these most of the time in a fairly efficient manner. Okay, these private goods and services are probably best left to the private market. But other goods, may not be, and let's look at those. So what happens if something is excludable but not rival in consumption? This is what we call club goods, and we've actually seen an example of a club good back in Chapter 15, or over in Chapter 15. We saw that natural monopolies were examples of club goods. So things like local utilities and cable TV, right, where the upfront costs were huge, but the marginal cost of providing electricity or cable for the first house could be extremely expensive, but then providing it and flipping it on for the second house after the grid has already been built, it costs almost nothing. The marginal cost would be very negligible. We might even say theoretically would be zero. And turning on the electricity for the second house does nothing to diminish the electricity consumption of the first house. Therefore, it would not be rival in consumption, but it would be excludable. If you don't pay your electric bill, they can turn it off, right? And so that would be an example of a club good. And those tend to be, firms with market power or even monopolies, where the government may have a legitimate role to maybe regulate those industries or even maybe directly provide some of those industries. Or maybe use antitrust law, which we looked at in chapter 15. Now we want to get to these bottom two categories. What happens if something is rival in consumption but not excludable? Okay, this is what we call common resources. Okay, this is things like fish in the ocean. Fish, it can't reasonably be prevented from going out and taking a boat out into the ocean and doing some fishing. But fish I catch and lobster I catch and crabs I catch are now fish and crabs and lobster that are no longer in the ocean for someone else to catch. And so it is rival. It's not easily excludable. We're going to tend to see common resources over-exhausted or over-consumed. Things like the environment and pollution. These things tend to be common resources. And there's going to be some market-based problems here where we might need some government intervention, public policy, regulation, so on, to try to help with these. We're also going to look at the case where something is not rival in consumption, nor is it excludable. These are public goods, things like a tornado siren, right? Tornado sirens, are not rival in consumption. You hearing the tornado siren doesn't prevent someone else from hearing it, but it's also not really excludable. Imagine someone trying to start a business, building a tornado siren for a city and saying, basically charging admission, saying, hey, I'm going to sell tickets. If you have one of these tickets, if you purchase one of them, say for $20, and you have one of these tickets, when a tornado's coming, I'm going to turn on the tornado siren and you'll be able to hear it and your family will be warned. You see any problems with that? Well, of course you do, right? Because people, once I turn on the tornado siren, not only will people with tickets be able to hear the siren, but also people who haven't paid me will also be able to hear it. Therefore, it's not excludable. Therefore, it's probably not going to be best for maybe a private firm or business to try to produce tornado sirens using the profit motive because of the excludability problem. It's probably going to be best for maybe local or even state governments to provide those services because it's a public good. Okay, so now let's apply these characterizations and these divisions to some different examples. A fireworks display at Roy Stewart Stadium, that's a stadium on campus you can sit in the parking lot and anything that is shot into the air you would be able to see. So of course, would it be rival in consumption? The answer would be no. Would it be excludable? Actually, the answer would be no. So therefore, that would actually probably be a public good. Okay, probably tends to be, why do most, 4th of July fireworks displays, are they shot off, by private companies with the intention of a profit motive? Probably not, unless they're, of course, paid for by the local municipality, right? Most of the time, your local governments are going to provide because it's a public good. It's not excludable. How about a fireworks display at Disney World, assuming you can't see the fireworks display if you don't gain admittance into the park? Okay, so with that assumption in mind, what would that be? Would it be excludable? Technically, yes. Okay, based on that assumption, would it be rival in consumption? The answer is no. And so it would be a club good or natural monopoly. Okay. What about fish in the ocean? Well, we've already looked at this. Would be rival but not excludable, therefore a common resource. What about fish in a private pond? That would be rival, but in this case probably excludable, right? I could probably build a fence or whatever in some way prevent people from accessing my private pond in a reasonable way. So that would be a private good. What about uncongested highways, no tolls? What that means, uncongested simply means that you're the only one on that road pretty much ever. It's a very it's a road that's not very often used by drivers. It's uncongested. So you being out there really isn't affecting anybody else. Therefore, it wouldn't be rival. It also wouldn't be excludable because it's not a toll road. Okay, so that would simply be a public good, right? Probably a private company building roads out in the county is probably not going to be very profitable. Whereas, that's probably why local, state, and federal governments probably are in the best position to provide, roads out in some of these very rural parts of the county, state, and country. Okay, what about congested highways? Okay, this is where it's a very heavily used road. You being on the road does impact other people and increases their travel time and so on. So it is rival in consumption, but there's no toll, so there's nothing preventing anyone from getting on the road. This would be a common resource because it wouldn't be excludable. What about basic research on cholesterol levels, right? So I'm just doing some basic academic research about, maybe what are some dietary associations with high cholesterol, and I publish that research in a publicly available journal. Well, that would be a public good. That knowledge would not be rival. Me knowing that information does not prevent someone else from knowing that information. It's also not excludable, especially if it's just widely disseminated, maybe on the internet or in this publication. No one's being prevented from knowing that. Just like no one's being prevented from knowing what 2 plus 2 is. That would be basic knowledge. Basic knowledge like 2 plus 2 would simply be a public good. But what about specific research on a cholesterol lowering drug for which a patent can be obtained? Okay, we talked about patents in chapter 15. Well, that would then turn this into a club good, right? A club good because it's still, that knowledge would still not be rival in consumption. There would be nothing preventing someone else from knowing it. Me knowing it, me consuming that knowledge or having that knowledge doesn't prevent someone else from knowing that knowledge. But with the patent in place, it does create a level of excludability in terms of applying that knowledge on producing this drug, and so that creates more of a club good and more of a monopoly scenario. Okay, what about a hot dog served at a private party? Now, don't get hung up on the private party aspect. Think about you're at the party and anybody's invited to the party. Okay, once you're at the party, there's hot dogs lined up on the table. Okay, no one's being excluded from going up to the table and getting as many hot dogs as they want, but any hot dog you consume is now a hot dog someone else can't consume. Therefore, that would be an example of a common resource. Those hot dogs, if they're desirable by consumers, would probably be demolished, right? Especially if there's not enough at the table for the number compared to the number of people at the party. Okay, and then a hot dog sold at a stand owned by the city government. Again, don't get hung up on who owns the stand. The hot dog would be rival in consumption, but if it's being sold at a vendor stand, that would be reasonably excludable. Therefore, that would actually be a private good, even though it's being provided by, quote unquote, the city government. Now, the problem, let's look at public goods first. The problem with, you ever seen this happen, right? People that hitching a ride on the back of a car or something? All right, that would be we might call that a free rider, getting a free ride, right? And that is the problem with public goods when left to market devices, right? A free rider is a person who receives the benefit of good or service but avoids paying for it. Okay, think about a tornado siren. Okay, and again, trying to start a business by implementing this tornado siren system and selling tickets. Okay, there would be probably too many free riders unless there was a lot of social pressure or something like that. There would most likely be too many free riders, people who would not buy my tickets, okay, but who I couldn't prevent from getting the benefit of the good. Therefore, my whole business plan would probably fall apart. And therefore, goods like this would tend to be underproduced if without some sort of public policy intervention. So public goods tend to be underproduced, okay, because of the free rider problem. And think about what that's very similar to from chapter 10. What else tended to be underproduced, okay, without public policy intervention? How about positive externalities, right? Things like flu vaccines, education. These things tended to be underproduced. So public goods actually create positive externalities on society, okay? And they tend to be, just like positive externalities, public goods tend to be underproduced because of the free rider problem, and the government can actually improve this market outcome by either directly producing or providing the public good or somehow incentivizing it. And so the connection between public goods and positive externalities needs to be seen. Okay, highway snow removal, in a city would be a public good. That's why you don't tend to see a lot of private industry providing that service, because it would be easy to free ride. Get all your neighbors on your street to pay for the service, and then you could simply free ride off of once they clear the road. Same thing with basic research. This is why a lot of research grants exist from the government and so on, because basic research tends to be, it's something good for society, but it tends to create a lot of positive externalities. It tends to create it's a public good because there could be a lot of free riders, and off of that knowledge that people that benefit from it that don't actually put in the time and effort and energy and money into doing the research. Therefore, the government tends to be involved in that grant process for research. Long time ago, several years ago, there were bikes on campus here that were provided by the student government, and these were yellow bikes, and basically the idea was they were free for students to use, and so they weren't owned by any individual, but you could use the bike, and maybe there was a yellow bike sitting out in front of the business building. You could get out of your class, go get on it, ride it to the cafeteria, get off of it, and go inside. Now, when you came back outside, it probably wasn't going to be there because it wasn't your bike, right? It was just sort of publicly provided. Okay. So think about the implications of that, and what kind of good would that be? Okay, again, think about it. Would they be excludable? The answer is no. They wouldn't be excludable because no one's being prevented from using the bikes or whatever. But would they be rival in consumption? Yeah, they would be. If I'm on the bike, someone else can't be on the bike, and any destruction I impose on the bike would now sort of diminish the next person's use of the bike. Well, that's not going to be a public good then. What kind of good would this be? These bikes were actually common resources. And if you know sort of what happened, these bikes, you might have predicted it, were actually within just a few weeks, they were either all gone or destroyed. They were just absolutely decimated. And we could have different conversations about why that happened, but from an economic perspective, this is what we would expect to happen from common resources. I mean, these bikes were not owned by anybody individually, and so there were none of those individual incentives to maintain the bikes for individual use. There was no profit motive or anything like that on an individual level, and so people that used the bike had no incentive to take care of them, right, from an economic perspective, and therefore seats would go missing, tires would go missing, entire bikes would go missing, and so on. And so it was sort of a failed policy. They haven't tried that since. But let's talk about, this is a nice illustration actually though of what we call the tragedy of the commons in economics. This idea comes from sort of the medieval times when you might have a sort of a community plot of land where all the individual farmers would send their cattle to go graze. Well, no individual farmer owned the land, and so there was no individual incentive to sort of not overgraze it, to make sure that there was plenty for everybody, and and in fact, they don't want to. The incentive would be that you would want is to not overuse the land so that it's good year after year after year after year. Because if you overgraze it, it might ruin the land for next year's use. Well, the problem is the incentives that are created with it being a community plot is just like the yellow bikes, right? I want to use the land with my cattle before someone else overuses it, right? And so I would have an incentive to use it early and often with my cattle. And the problem is everyone has that same incentive. Therefore, what tended to happen? This community, this common land tended to become a tragedy, tended to become overconsumed and overused. Okay? The tragedy of the commons illustrates why common resources tend to be overconsumed more than is socially desirable. And I want to make a connection here between the tragedy of the commons and common resources and negative externalities from chapter 10. Remember, in chapter 10, we said negative externalities were overproduced, okay, and were larger than socially desirable, or led to outcomes larger than socially desirable. Therefore, we wanted public policy to restrict production and consumption of negative externalities. Very similar idea here. The tragedy of the commons creates a problem of overconsumption as well, right, or even overproduction. And when common resources are present in public policy, could be beneficial to restrict some of that consumption and production. Okay, you can also think about it in case of maybe living mates, in a college setting. So when I was in college, had some, roommates, and there were some private rooms that we lived in, and there were some common areas like the kitchen and the bathroom and the living area. It was amazing to me. The individual rooms often remained relatively clean and well kept, whereas the common areas like the bathroom, living area, and kitchen, especially the bathroom and kitchen, tended to be disaster areas. And the reason can be understood simply with this dynamic. Those were common resources, right? Our private rooms were probably more private goods that could be excludable, rival, but excludable. I could close my door and lock it. Whereas, why would I spend a lot of time cleaning up the bathroom or kitchen when I couldn't prevent my roommates, right, from dirtying it up just 30 minutes later? And so there was no incentive for anyone to do any serious cleaning work, lots of incentive to overuse it. These common areas in dorms as well as apartment buildings and such tend to be common resources as well, and exhibit the tragedy of the commons. Okay, you can think about public parks in the same way, and so on. Tragedy of the commons. Okay, so again, what are some examples of common resources? Clean air and water can tend to be overused and over polluted, right? Because again, because it's more common area, and it can exhibit tragedy of the commons. Congested roads that aren't toll roads, right? I mean, if there's nothing preventing people from getting on these roadways, right, I have an incentive to try to get on there early and often to try to beat the other passengers, the other drivers. The problem is everybody has that same incentive, and some of these roads in busy places tend to become congested. Okay, fish, whales, and other wildlife, fishing in the ocean and so on, again, are common resources and can tend to exhibit the tragedy of the commons. Okay, another good example, from history. How about bison? From the 19th century and even before that, right? I mean, they used to be very plentiful in this nation. Now on the verge of extinction. Why? Well, an easy way to understand it would be the tragedy of the commons. These were common resources. Buffalo killed by poachers were now buffalo that didn't exist, right, and couldn't reproduce and so on. But there was really nothing excluding these people, the Westerners and so on, moving west, and poachers and so on and so forth, and different reasons. There was nothing preventing them from killing these animals. And so millions were killed, right? And we had a tragedy of the commons situation. So in hunting, what can be done? What about, what kind of public policies can prevent these tragedies from happening, right? Well, in hunting, it's pretty simple and straightforward, right? They regulate the use of the resource. Think about hunting licenses, fishing licenses. The basic economic rationale behind hunting and fishing licenses is to prevent the tragedy of the commons. We don't want to kill all the deer in one year because we want to have hunting for the next season and so on and so forth. And we don't want to wipe out that species. Same thing with fishing. Okay, and so these would be the tragedy of the commons would probably take place in hunting and fishing if it wasn't for some sort of public policy intervention with these licenses, right? Regulating the use of those resources. You can auction off permits. There's some other applications there. If the resource is land, you could convert it to private land or a private good by dividing and selling up the parcels, giving individual incentives to maintain the land. So there's different ways the public policy can try to help with common resources. Okay, let me ask this question: why do people who never litter in their own lawn sometimes litter in public areas? Right? Well, think about it just from an incentive standpoint, right? If I litter at my home in my lawn, I've got to deal with that cost because it's my property, right? If my front yard is filthy, I've got to live in that filth, right? And so I have a private incentive on my private property to maintain it for my own enjoyment, and I can pretty easily keep people off my property so it is excludable. So in a private land, private good situation, I'm probably less likely to litter and have my property filthy, whereas if I'm on public property or something like that and I litter, I might not necessarily have to deal with the consequences of that, right? And someone else might have to pick up after me. And so also think about this question, okay? Think about elephants and cattle, right? Specifically cows, right? And I'm not trying to be morbid, but both of these animals are killed, elephants mostly by poachers, okay, like in Africa and other places. But in the United States, we kill a lot of cattle every single day. Yet one of these animals is on the verge of extinction, the elephant, and one that is actually killed more of these animals are killed every day. But actually, as a species, the cows are not on the verge of extinction at all. What's the difference? Well, the difference, just like the littering example, is property rights. Okay? Elephants tend to be common resources. They're not owned by anybody. And because they're not owned, but they're not excludable, but they are rival in consumption, and so poachers kill them for their tusks, and they have no incentive to maintain the population for future generations, again, because they don't have the property right to them. And so they couldn't benefit from it necessarily from that exercise of self-control. And therefore you had, just like the buffalo and the bison in North America in the 19th century, the elephants are on the verge of extinction. Whereas the cattle, the exact opposite is the case, right? Even though we kill lots of cattle, cattle can be owned by ranchers. So there's property rights involved. And if I'm a rancher, I'm not going to kill all my cattle in one season. That would be stupid, because I want to have, because of the profit motive, I want to develop a steady stream of cash flow. And so I'm not going to kill all my cattle, maybe not even most of my cattle in any given season, right? And I'm going to therefore preserve the species for generations to come. And so because of property rights and establishing property rights, then this common resource has been turned into a private good and has fixed the tragedy of the commons. And so really that's the key here with common resources, is what we really would like public policy to do is to establish property rights. And if we can establish effective property rights, then we can create individual incentives to fix the tragedy of the commons. So in conclusion, remember, private goods are excludable and rival in consumption. Private markets are usually pretty good at providing those goods and efficient. Public goods are not excludable, not rival, probably need public policy to fix the free rider problem. Public goods are directly related to positive externalities from Chapter 10. Common resources are rival but not excludable, probably need some sort of public policy to establish property rights to help restrict access and so on. Common resources are directly connected to negative externalities from Chapter 10. And then you have club goods or natural monopolies, which are excludable but not rival. These tend to be monopolies, and public policy could probably help mitigate the market power of those club goods. Okay. When goods are not private, there could be a justifiable role for government to play in the marketplace.